I never told my son I make $35,000 a month. His wife screamed, "Get out, you useless old man. We don't need you." My son threw my things out the door. A month later, I bought the house across the street. When he saw my name on the deed, well, let me tell you what happened. My name is Charles Miller. I'm 59 years old, and that February night when my son Ted threw my duffel bag onto their front porch like it was garbage, I thought I knew what rock bottom felt like. But let me back up and tell you how I got there. After my wife Sarah passed from cancer 12 years ago, I threw myself into building something. I wasn't going to sit around feeling sorry for myself in our ranch house outside Billings, Montana. Sarah always said I had a good head for logistics, and she was right. I built Miller Transport Solutions from nothing. Just me, a used truck, and a lot of 18-hour days. By the time I sold the company when I was 55, we had 200 trucks running routes across the mountain states. The buyer paid me $4.2 million cash, plus I kept some commercial properties that bring in steady rental income. Between that and my investment portfolio, I clear about $35,000 every month without lifting a finger. But here's the thing. I never told anybody about the money, not my neighbors, not my poker buddies, and especially not my son Ted. I drive a 2019 Ford F-150, buy my clothes at Costco, and live in the same 1,800 square foot house Sarah and I bought 25 years ago. The only luxury I allow myself is my woodworking shop in the garage, where I build furniture and cabinets for fun. Ted was my only kid. Good boy, smart enough, worked as an insurance adjuster in Denver. We were close, or I thought we were, until he married Grace Parker 3 years ago. Grace was 28, 7 years younger than Ted, and had this way of looking around a room like she was calculating what everything cost. She wasn't mean at first. She was careful. There's a difference. A mean person shows you their claws right away. A careful person keeps them hidden until they decide you're in their way. The first warning sign came at Christmas 2 years ago. I'd driven down from Montana with a handmade oak dining table I'd built for their new house. Grace thanked me politely. Then I heard her tell her friend on the phone that it was rustic and didn't really fit their aesthetic. The table ended up in their basement. Second warning came last Easter when Grace made a comment about how hard it must be living alone on a fixed income after retirement. I was sipping my coffee and didn't say anything. Fixed income. Hell, I was making more in dividends than most people make working full-time. Third warning came in August when Ted called and suggested, real gentle-like, that I think about selling the Montana place and moving in with them. They had a guest room that wasn't being used. It would be easier for everyone if I was closer to family. I should have asked easier for who, but I was lonely. That's the truth I'm not. Ashamed of. Sarah had been gone 12 years, and those Montana winters get long when you're by yourself. Ted was my boy, the kid I'd taught to drive stick and throw a curveball. I said yes. I moved to Denver in January, brought my clothes, my laptop, my financial files, and 2 boxes of Sarah's things I couldn't part with. The guest room was nice enough, queen bed, decent desk, window facing their backyard. I offered to pay rent multiple times. Ted said it wasn't necessary. Grace said nothing, which I later learned was her loudest language. First 3 weeks went fine. Then Grace started making comments about my schedule. I've always been an early riser, up at 4:30, coffee, check my investments and rental properties, handle any business before the house woke up. Grace said my typing was too loud. I bought a quieter keyboard. She said the light from my laptop bothered her when she walked past. I started keeping the door closed. She said she could hear me on my morning calls with my property or manager. I started using earbuds and whispering. I was getting smaller every day, and I could feel it happening. Then came March 8th. I'd been on a call with my financial advisor, Helen, about some property tax questions. Ran 20 minutes longer than planned. When I came out of the guest room, Grace was standing in the hallway with her arms crossed. Ted was behind her, looking at the floor. "Charles," Grace said. She never called me Dad, not once. "We need to talk about boundaries." I followed them to the kitchen. What happened next took 12 minutes. I counted them later because that's what your mind does when it's trying to measure how bad something hurt. Grace started talking about how this arrangement wasn't working, how I was always underfoot, how the guest room was actually supposed to be her home office for her crafting business. She sold maybe $150 worth of homemade candles last year, how they'd been more than generous. Then she said it, the thing I'll never forget as long as I live, You're a useless old man living off our charity. We don't need a broke widower taking up space in our home. Pack your things." I looked at Ted, my son, the boy I'd carried on my shoulders to every Little League game, who I'd stayed up with all night when Sarah was in the hospital that last time. He walked to the guest room and started pulling my duffel bag out from under the bed. I stood in that kitchen for exactly long enough to decide I wasn't going to give Grace the satisfaction of seeing me break. That was the only decision I made in those first 60 seconds. Everything else, the hurt, the disbelief, the specific pain of watching my son refuse to look me in the eye, I stuffed down deep. Ted stacked my things by the front door: the duffel bag, my laptop case, Sarah's 2 boxes. He was neat about it, which somehow made it worse, like he was organizing my whole life into a pile he could forget about. It was 28 degrees outside. I know because I checked my phone while I stood on their porch, my mind collecting facts to keep from falling apart. Grace was already back in the kitchen, making tea like nothing happened. Ted stood at the door. "Dad," he said, still not looking at me. "I'm sorry, it's not working." "You said that," I replied. "You can call when you get settled." I picked up my bags, looked at my son one more time, and said very quietly, "I will." Then I walked to my truck and drove. Drove for 30 minutes without knowing where I was going, which isn't like me. I'm a man who's had a destination most of his adult life. But that night, Denver moved past my windows like a city I'd never seen before. I ended up at a Marriott near the airport, paid cash for 3 nights from the emergency envelope I keep in my laptop bag, old habit from the trucking days. Went to my room, sat on the bed, and gave myself exactly 1 hour to feel everything. I cried for Sarah first. Always do in the worst moments because she would have known exactly what to say and when. To put her hand on mine. Then I cried for Ted, not the man who'd thrown me out in the cold, but the boy I'd raised. Then I cried for myself, briefly, because self-pity never solved anything. At the 61-minute mark, I washed my face, opened my laptop, and started a new document. Titled it, "What is True?" This is something I learned in business. When everything feels chaotic, establish the facts. What is true? I am 59 years old. I am in good health. I have no mortgage. My investments generated $34,800 last month. I have $2.6 million in savings and investments. I have been told I am useless by a woman who has never asked me a single question about my life. My son did not defend me. I read it back twice. Then I wrote one more line. What is also true? I do not have to accept this as the end of anything. I spent the next 3 days doing 2 things simultaneously: grieving and planning. In the mornings, I handled my business emails, reviewed property reports, checked my stock portfolio. In the afternoons, I made calls. Found a furnished apartment in Capitol Hill, 2 miles from Ted and Grace's house. Month-to-month lease. Signed it on day 3. Good apartment, hardwood floors, big windows, kitchen that looked out on a maple tree. Paid 6 months up front, which made the landlord happy enough to stop asking questions. Moved in with my duffel bag, laptop, and Sarah's boxes. Bought groceries, bought a coffee maker, bought a small cactus for the kitchen window because they survive anything. Then I sat in my new living room and let myself think. Not feel. Think. I thought about Grace's face when she said useless old man. The satisfaction in it, like she was delivering a verdict she'd been preparing for months. And I thought about Ted's silence, which was its own kind of verdict. They had decided who I was, built a version of me, broke, dependent, a charity case taking up space in their suburban house. Then they evicted that version. Problem was, the version they'd built had nothing to do with who I actually was, and that gave me an idea. I opened my laptop and went to Zillow, typed in Ted and Grace's address on Maple Street, Denver, Colorado. Looked at what was available in their neighborhood. One listing stopped my scrolling. Directly across the street from their blue front door, I could see it in the photos, was a 3-bedroom craftsman house. Gray with white trim, covered porch, big oak tree in front. Listed at $425,000, available immediately. Seller motivated. I stared at that listing for a long time. Then I called Helen, my financial advisor. "Helen," I said, "I need to talk about a real estate purchase." "Of course. Investment property? Personal residence?" I gave her the address. Helen had been handling my money for 8 years. She'd learned not to ask why I wanted something, only whether the numbers worked. Give me 24 hours, she said. I'll run the comps and check your liquidity position. I know my liquidity position, Helen. I need you to confirm. A cash purchase won't create tax complications. A pause. Charles, that's a significant withdrawal. I know what it is. I'll have everything ready tomorrow morning. Next, I called Fred Davis, a real estate attorney I'd found through the Colorado Bar Association website. Explained the situation. I wanted to purchase a specific property, pay cash, and handle the transaction with complete confidentiality about the buyer until closing. Not unusual for cash purchases, Fred said. We can use a trust as the purchasing entity. The Sarah Miller Family Trust, I said. I'd set up that trust 5 years ago for estate planning. Sarah's name on it still gave me comfort. Fred said he'd start the paperwork. I asked how fast we could close with a motivated seller. Cash, no contingencies, 2 weeks, maybe 3. Make it 2, I said. Over the next few days, I moved quietly. Drove past Maple Street twice, not stopping in front of the house, but taking the alley to look at the property from different angles. Good bones, newer roof, detached garage that could work as a workshop. The listing agent was a young guy named Victor, who seemed amazed that a cash buyer had appeared 48 hours after the listing went live. I let him be amazed. Asked practical questions about the HVAC foundation, electrical. No HOA restrictions. Good. I didn't drive past Ted and Grace's blue door. Didn't need to. I could see their porch clearly in the listing photos. During the second week, while Fred finalized the purchase agreement, I got the information that changed everything from a matter of dignity to a matter of record. My neighbor at the apartment complex, George Wilson, was a retired teacher who'd lived in Ted's neighborhood for 6 years before moving out. George and I had struck up a friendship over coffee in the building's lobby. George called me on a Thursday evening. Charles, he said, I don't know if I should tell you this, but I think you need to know. Tell me. George had run into Dorothy Evans, who still lived next door to Ted and Grace. Dorothy had mentioned something she thought was common knowledge. Grace had been planning my removal since October, not since the boundaries conversation, since October, 5 months before it happened. Dorothy had heard it directly from Grace during a fence line conversation in November. Grace had told Dorothy that Charles's situation would be resolved by spring. She'd described the guest room as already spoken for, her crafting business expansion, the timeline she'd outlined to Ted. She'd said, and Dorothy quoted this because she found it striking, he'll have no choice. He sold his house. Where's he going to go? I sat very still in my apartment. I'd put the Montana ranch on the market in December, 3 months after Grace made that calculation. Sold it in January because Ted had convinced me I wouldn't need it anymore, that Denver was home now, that they wanted me there. Those conversations had started in September, 1 month before Grace told Dorothy the situation would be resolved by spring. The invitation hadn't been an invitation. It had been a trap. Get the old man to sell his house, eliminate his options, then remove him on our timeline. I asked George if Dorothy would put what she heard in writing. I think she would, George said. She felt terrible when she found out what happened. Can you ask her for me? 2 days later, I had a signed, notarized statement from Dorothy Evans, attesting to her conversation with Grace Parker Miller regarding the planned removal of Charles Miller from the family home. Fred added it to the file. On a gray Tuesday morning in April, I signed the closing documents for the Sarah Miller Family Trust's acquisition of 47 Maple Street, Denver, Colorado, the house directly across from my son's blue front door. I drove to the closing, signed everything, accepted the keys from Victor, drove to my new house, unlocked the front door, walked through the empty rooms that smelled like old wood and fresh paint. I stood at the living room window and looked across the street. I could see their porch, the hanging plant Grace was so proud of. Ted's Subaru in the driveway. I thought, Ted, when you see my name on that mailbox, I want you to understand something. This isn't revenge. This is your father showing you the cost of underestimating him. Then I went to measure the windows for curtains. I didn't rush the move. Hired a small company, 2 guys named Oliver and Arthur, who worked efficiently and didn't ask personal questions. Over one Saturday, my life moved from the Capitol Hill apartment to 47 Maple Street. I'd bought furniture, a proper bed, a reading chair, a desk for my office setup, kitchen table with 4 chairs, even though I'd probably eat alone most nights. Because a table for four says something different about a man's life than a table for one. I bought curtains too, cream-colored for the front windows facing the street. I didn't open those curtains on moving day. Wasn't ready yet. The discovery happened Sunday morning, 18 hours after the moving truck left. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard a car door slam. Not casual, sharp, like someone had just seen something that made them forget to be careful. Footsteps on my porch. The knock was loud, just barely not pounding. I took my coffee to the door. I was wearing my good navy sweater, the one Sarah had bought me for my 50th birthday. How you dress tells people what kind of conversation you're ready to have. I opened the door. Ted and Grace stood on my porch. Ted looked like a man who just discovered the ground wasn't where he thought it was. His face was doing confusion, something like fear, and underneath it all, anger working its way up. Grace's face was doing what it always did, calculating. "Dad," Ted said. First time I'd heard his voice since he'd carried my bags to that cold porch. "Ted," I said. "Grace." I didn't offer a smile. I held my coffee and waited. "What is this?" Grace said, her voice controlled but barely. "What are you doing?" "I live here," I said. "You bought this house?" Ted asked. "The Sarah Miller Family Trust did." "Yes." A pause. Grace's eyes moved past me, cataloging the interior, adding up what she saw and what it meant. "This is insane," she said. Then the control slipped slightly. "You can't do this. You can't just move across the street from us." "I'm not aware of any ordinance preventing it," I said. "Are you?" Ted stepped forward. "Dad, this isn't... You're making a point, I get it, but this is too far." "I thought about it quite carefully," I said, "over several weeks." "We want you to sell it," Grace said. "We'll help you find something else in Denver, something comfortable but not..." She gestured at the 30 yards between my porch and their front door. "Not here." "No, thank you," I said. Grace's composure finally cracked. It didn't leave gradually. It left all at once, like a dam breaking. "You're doing this to punish us," she said, voice rising. "You're a vindictive old man, and you're doing this to make our lives miserable, and I won't allow it. Do you hear me, Grace?" Ted said quietly, but not to stop her, to warn her. He could see what I could see. She'd lost the room. "You have no friends here?" Grace continued. "Nobody on this street wants a bitter old man watching their house from his window. You'll be miserable and alone, and when you finally come to your senses..." "Grace." This time Ted's voice had an edge. She stopped, breathing hard. I looked at my son. "Ted, I have a signed, notarized statement from a neighbor on this street documenting a conversation where your wife planned my removal from your home 5 months before it happened. During the same period, you were convincing me to sell my Montana ranch. That document is in my attorney's file. I want you to know it exists." The porch went very quiet. Ted's face did something I hadn't expected. It cracked, not in anger, in something that looked like shame. Grace was staring at me, the calculation running slower now. "You have 2 choices," I said. "You can leave my porch and we can be neighbors, which requires nothing from you except basic civility. Or you can continue this conversation in a direction I promise you'll find much more uncomfortable. What would you like to do?" They left. I spent the next week setting up my home office and getting to know the neighborhood properly. Knocked on George Wilson's door. He lived 3 houses down. We talked for an hour about his 30 years teaching high school shop class. Good man, firm handshake, the kind of guy who notices when your fence needs fixing. Met Dorothy Evans next, the woman who'd provided the statement. She was relieved to see me looking well, invited me in for coffee without hesitation. Over the following weeks, I met 6 more neighbors through natural conversations and one-block barbecue that Victor Thompson organized. I brought potato salad, helped move picnic tables, had good talks about property values and local issues. It was at that barbecue that Victor said, casually, "Nice to finally meet you properly, Charles. Ted mentioned you'd been struggling financially. You seem like you're doing fine." "What did Ted say exactly?" I asked pleasantly. Victor glanced toward number 52, Ted's house, then back at me. "Just that you'd had some financial troubles. Lost your house up north." I smiled, took a sip of my beer. "How interesting," I said. Said nothing else because I didn't need to. The house across the street said everything. The neighborhood association meeting came 6 weeks later. Victor organized them quarterly, rotating through houses. This one was at Arthur Rodriguez's place, 8 households attending. I arrived on time with lemon pound cake. For 40 minutes, we discussed ordinary things: stop signs, tree trimming, summer block party plans. Ted and Grace had arrived early, establishing themselves before I got there. Grace was performing well, engaged and charming, but she hadn't accounted for Dorothy. When Grace said, responding to block party planning, it would be so nice for the whole neighborhood to feel like real community, not just strangers living near each other, Dorothy couldn't hold it inside anymore. I think community starts with honesty, Dorothy said conversationally, about who people are and what they've actually done. Absolutely, Grace said smoothly. I've been thinking about that since Charles moved in. Someone told me Charles was a man in financial trouble who needed looking after. Then he bought a house on our street for cash. Victor looked at me. Cash purchase? The Sarah Miller Family Trust, I said pleasantly. Yes. Someone told you Charles was struggling financially? Arthur asked Dorothy. Dorothy glanced toward Ted. I may have repeated something I shouldn't have, Ted said quietly to the table. It wasn't accurate, he added, not looking at me. The table went quiet. I built a business after my wife died, I said. I've been supporting myself entirely for 12 years. I mention this because I think it's important for people on this street to know who their neighbor actually is. There was a period when I was staying with Ted and Grace. It ended abruptly in March when I was told to leave. I found a place to stay, took some time, and bought this house. That's the whole story. That's a very selective version, Grace said. Then tell the complete version, I said evenly. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. You have no right to discuss our family's private. You discuss my finances on this street, I said. You describe me as a man in difficulty, which influenced how my neighbors saw me. I'm simply introducing myself now. You planned this? Grace said, her voice climbing. You came here tonight to humiliate us. I came here because Victor organized a neighborhood meeting, and I live on this street, I said. Grace stood and walked out. Ted followed her, pausing at the door to give me a long, complicated look, before going after her. The meeting continued. Ted came to my door alone 3 days later. We sat at my kitchen table with coffee. She didn't know you'd bought the house, he said finally. She said you didn't have money like that. She told you I was struggling, that the Montana sale was because I was in debt. I believed her. How long did you know about the plan? I knew she wanted the room back. I knew it was coming. I didn't know about October specifically, but I knew it was coming. And you let it come. Yes. That was the word I needed, not an excuse, just yes. Ted, I love you in a way that isn't negotiable. You're my son, and that's permanent. But I won't pretend what was done to me was an accident. It was planned. Grace built it, and you consented to it. I know. What happens next between us depends on whether you can be honest about that. Ted and Grace divorced 4 months later. She'd been hiding $23,000 in credit card debt. The crafting business had generated $150 last year, not the expansion she'd claimed needed my room. Ted stayed in the Blue House. We had dinner every few weeks through fall and winter. The relationship of two people who had hurt each other and decided honesty was worth more than pretending otherwise. He started seeing a therapist, told me so directly. On his birthday, I made Sarah's German chocolate cake. He ate 2 pieces and looked, for the first time in months, like my boy. A year is enough time for a street to know you. By the following spring, 47 Maple Street had become home. The front garden produced tulips, then roses from Victor's cuttings. I put a bench under the oak tree for morning coffee before work. My business had grown, teaching other retirees investment management, consulting for small logistics companies. Income pushed past $40,000 monthly. George and I had dinner every Thursday. Dorothy became a genuine friend. These weren't small things. They're the actual texture of a life. I'm 60 now. House paid for. Business running strong. Street full of people who know my name. The cactus in my kitchen window has 12 new shoots. Sometimes I sit under the oak in the evening light and feel something I can only describe as settled. Not triumphant, settled. I learned that respect isn't given. It's demonstrated. That financial independence means more than money. It means options. That sometimes the best revenge is simply showing people who you really are. What would you have done in my place? Sometimes the greatest victory isn't getting revenge on those who wronged you. It's building a life so good that their opinion of you becomes irrelevant. They thought they were discarding a burden, but what they actually did was free a man who had forgotten his own power.